the 2018 Commonwealth Innovation Forum, brought to you by Destination Gold Coast.
Our panel discussion now is on the power we have to make a significant difference to the environmental impacts humanity is having on the globe. And how does our leadership ensure that all our economies, including those emerging, will be able to achieve growth and industrialisation while still having regard to minimising adverse effects on the environment? And to lead our discussion, we have Dr. Paul Greenfield AO, Chair of the International Scientific Advisory Committee for the Great Barrier Reef Foundation. Please welcome Paul Greenfield.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining us on what is getting late on a Friday afternoon, so congratulations. So in this session, which we're going to talk about sustainable and renewable products and practices. I find the concept of a sustainable world in the future vague. I don't know exactly what it looks like. It's sort of like climbing a mountain where the top of the mountain's totally shrouded in cloud. I don't actually know what's up there. But what I do know is I know the direction I've got to go in. And what I think we're going to talk about today is how we make some of those steps in that particular direction. I think one of the nicest definitions well, it wasn't really a definition of sustainability, but I was giving a talk to a group of 10 to 11 to 12-year-olds, school kids, about how did they think, how was climate change going to impact them over the next 20 to 30 years? And people said the usual things: drought, floods, they might get flooded from sea level rise. And then there's this girl who was about 11 or 12 put her hand up and said, "My main worry is that there will be crocodiles in the Brisbane River and I won't be able to go sailing." And I thought, you know, she's got it right, because it is quite possible crocodiles could end up in the Brisbane River. I think by then she'll probably be Prime Minister, so she may not want to go sailing in the Brisbane River. But she personalised it, she brought it back to herself. And in a way, I have a lot of time for that. We have today a great panel, from Australia, from Africa, from Japan, from the United States. Can I introduce Mr. Troy Collins? Troy is a director of Southern Oil and Northern Oil. We have Dr. Siya Tutela. He's the CEO of Africa Bio, which is a membership-based biotechnology organisation based in Pretoria. We have Jim Lane, whom you, as you already know, is the editor and publisher of Biofuels Digest and other journals. Jim, you might.
You want me over here?
Oh, yeah. It doesn't really matter, I guess.
That's okay. I can be to your left. I'm always on the left.
Camillo Motohisa from the Nissan Motor Corporation. And finally, Henrietta Marie, who is Associate Professor at Central Queensland University. So we're here to talk about renewable and sustainable products and practices. The definition that, if you like, triggered some sort of coherent thinking around sustainability tends to be taken back to the Brundtland Commission. I actually don't like this definition very much, but it is that sustainable development is the kind of development that meets the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generation to meet their own needs. It's hard to argue with it. It's so bland. It's so sort of, so you can't really say it's bad. The problem I have with this too, and it is very bland, it doesn't actually suggest what you might do, which is one of the things we want to tackle today. The second problem is it doesn't acknowledge that future generations will be innovative in their own rights. So therefore, for us to judge exactly what they can and cannot do, history would suggest we're not very good at it. Anyway, so what we're trying to do today, to start off with, I'm going to ask each of the panel members to give me an example from their field of what's a specific product or practice that they think will move us in the direction of sustainability. Remember, we're not going to argue about what's at the top of the mountain. It's up there. There's something there. It's likely to be, in many ways, an interesting place. But we don't know exactly how to map that. But we do know we've got to go up the mountain. So in terms of moving up that mountain, can I ask Troy, in your area, what do you think is a significant product or practice change that would move us up this mountain?
Thanks very much, Paul. And I guess before I comment on that, through the wonders of technology and the invasiveness of Facebook, there's a clip that we might be able to play which relates to an announcement we made with Minister Enoch about 6 weeks ago.
In January, China implemented a ban on importing foreign waste, throwing a spanner in the works for waste management in Queensland. But now, our state's trash has become Southern Oil's treasure, an influx in domestic waste availability driving their development of biofuels.
We've got a huge opportunity to grow massive industry across this state, to diversify our economy and be known as the place where biofuels is created and where biofuels are used.
They're refining old tyres, vegetation and plastic bottles, turning them into biofuels that can be used to power road vehicles and heavy machinery.
We import 96% of our fuels into this country, so there's not much made, indigenously.
A mammoth process that will create construction jobs, with 14 waste processing hubs needing to be built. It could even help with the eradication of one of Australia's most invasive plants.
Prickly acacia infestations cover around 6.6 million hectares of land in Queensland alone. That's a landmass the size of Tasmania. And Southern Oil says the invasive weed would be the perfect addition to their biofuel recipe.
Southern Oil says 1 million tonnes of biomass can be refined and turned into about 300 million litres of fuel.
In terms of fuel security, this is something that we should have been doing, in my view, a long time ago. Not to mention the fact that it's great for the environment.
Lily Greer, Win News.
Enjoyed this Win News.
And so that was roughly accurate as a news report. There were some numbers that weren't quite right by the Win News team. And I guess that announcement we made with Minister Enoch on the 2nd of March was important from a technical capability perspective, that our laboratory is certified, that we had produced number 2 quality ASTM certified diesel from 4 waste streams, and that ran the Bobcat and the irrigation pump. So that's all good. That technical know-how is wonderful. What I'd probably say though, and sort of flipping it a little bit, Paul, is my observation is it's no good just having good technology, great idea. You really need to understand the value chain, and you need to understand your end-to-end business process from whatever feedstock you might be using right through to distribution. And the one thing I'd say, we spend a lot of time and effort on the economics, the logistics, the aggregation of waste, right through to ultimately it's got to be sustainable economically and not just sustainable from an environmental perspective. So my observation would be to everyone is think very carefully and look very closely at your total value chain.
Thanks, Troy. I mean, that fits in with Jim's talk before the break, where he talked about resilience as being, it's not just being sustainable in the conventional sense isn't enough, as you're saying. Sia, can you give an example from your experience of what you see as a way of helping us up this mountain of sustainability?
Yeah, thanks, thanks, Paul. Part of the unfortunate effects, unfortunately, of I'll say climate change broadly as a concept, but technology that is not maintained or that is not monitored to bring about sustainability that we see in present is the issue of the depredation of crops that are able to resist the changes that we see in the environment at present. I'll give an example. In most of the African countries that we're facing with the serious drought, the emergence of new diseases and pests, and unfortunately, if we don't start to innovate and bring technologies that are going to be able to deal with those into the future, we're likely to end up without a crop. but with new diseases that are coming up. And as a technology that has come up, you know, there's an example is that of a water efficient maize that has been developed in partnership with industry and a number of African countries on trial, and the AATF. It's a technology that is trialed purely to mitigate the issue of climate change in the African continent, especially in many countries within the sub-Saharan Africa. And we see that technology as a future of how, at least with crops like maize, we can be able to continue to use those crops because they form most of the staple food for people and for feeding the African continent. And we believe that with that technology, and technologies basically that are there to resist and mitigate the changes within the climate, that's how we can be able to then use technology to avoid those changes into the future, and more importantly, to make sure that the future is still able to do agriculture and to produce food in a sustainable manner.
Okay, so thank you. You've introduced the concept that even as we move to greater sustainability, we are going to have to adapt to a changing world. The world is going to change regardless. Therefore, we need innovation to tackle the changes that are likely to occur, again, for all the reasons that you just gave. Jim, you gave us so many examples in your talk. I don't know how you might choose one, but out of all the various products and processes that you've talked about and you report on, is there one which you think, even if it's in an embryonic state, that you think has greater potential than others?
One technology that's worth pointing to is going to be deployed here. Actually, it's Amyris technology. And I think it's a really good example of a sustainable technology for a couple of reasons. And I think it's also very resilient. And some of you may be familiar with the Amyris story, but just for those of you who weren't but saw the wonderful story of the development of the banana that began with the vitamin A banana that you saw, began with the Bill and Melinda Gates making an investment through the foundation into a new technology. It's really the story of the Amyris as well. It started out of a lab in Emeryville, California, Jay Kiesling's lab. Neil Renninger worked on that, if you know Ripple Foods. He's the CEO there. Also one of the guys who was one of the MIT Takedown Vegas team, if you ever saw the movie 21. So very smart, a bunch of smarty pants over there. And they developed a technology that could solve the world's malaria problem, because malaria treatment is very, very expensive. And they developed a technology based on yeast. So it's the same stuff that we use to make wine or beer. It's a yeast-based technology. They ferment it from sugar, same as you would do making wine or beer. So it's just a slightly modified organism, and it's grown in a fermenter, and it makes an anti-malarial that was marketed by Sanofi, and it brought down the cost of malaria treatment, where it was introduced by a factor of 10. So a very, very important technology, making artemisinin. And you just change one gene in that technology, and it becomes Amyris technology. It's a wonderful platform. And one of the things that it can do, it makes a product called farnesene, I think we heard a little bit about it earlier today. And farnesene can be used to make very high-end fragrances, very, very high-value flavorings. And it's also the underlying technology in a group of products called Biossance, which is sold in very, very high-end Sephora stores and around the world. So it's a very profitable technology. It's now, the company is over $100 million in revenue. And so it meets a criteria that's very important, which is when we talk about sustainability, we often talk about environmental sustainability. I think all of us understand that. That's one of the 3 pillars. And social sustainability is really important too. It has to support the community that it works in. But the 3rd pillar we sometimes forget to mention, which is economic sustainability. It has to be economically viable. And Amyris technology has found a way to be so. If you were investing in Amyris this year, congratulations, you are a very smart person. You made more money than those who are investing in Bitcoin. That stock has gone up almost about 400% this year. So those of you that bought into that technology and bought into the vision of Queensland in partnering with that technology are much richer and can buy us all a beer later on. So congratulations to those of you who followed that vision. So it's a very sustainable technology economically, and it's getting big. But it doesn't just make high-end fragrances. It also makes all kinds of products. There's over 5,000 different products that technology can make. And it's resilient also in another way. Even though we don't use it for this, when deployed in Queensland, it will be able to make, on a day's notice, diesel and jet fuel that can go into military applications. So if you ever had a military crisis here, and those of you that are watching the South China Sea ought to watch it very carefully. We live in very strange times. 60% of the world's oil flows through the South China Sea. That's why we're focused on it. And it's very important to have resilient options, because Australia does not have petroleum refining capacity. You have to buy it, refine somewhere else, and if you can't ship it down here, you won't get it. And your civilization will disappear in about 2 weeks without petroleum. And so you need the ability to, on a dime or on a 10-cent piece, to flip production over to something that's very, very important to you that will be very, very scarce, and that could be fuel. So here's an example of a technology that has a viable market today, making something that we know very well, that we pay a lot of money for, fragrances. It can make 5,000 different products, and it can make fuel, diesel and jet fuel for military or land-based, just to keep the economy going if ever you were to need it. That's a very resilient technology, makes money. It's coming here to Queensland. That's being a good example for me of what is a renewable, sustainable, resilient technology. And congratulations to Queensland for having the vision to partner with it.
And the raw material would be sugar.
Yeah, it's made from just ordinary table sugar. So it's if you can grow sugar cane, you can be a platform for that technology. The only reason actually that we don't use it to make fuel is simply because sugar is so valuable around the world these days. It's about 15 cents a pound in the world markets for sugar. So that's a little bit more expensive for making a fuel. If it was 5 cents a pound, you would make diesel and jet fuel every day.
Okay. Thank you. Camillo.
Yes.
You work for an important automotive company.
Yeah.
I'm sure you have some ideas of how sustainable products could be developed, and you're going to show us, I think, a couple of overheads.
Right. Yes. Yes. Our company has a vision to reduce the consumption of fuel and also reduce the emission of the CO2. To realize this idea, our research center proposed the new mobility in 2016. We unveiled our prototype fuel cell vehicle in the Rio Olympic game, which employ the solid oxide fuel cell, which enable to use the ethanol in the vehicle. And the ethanol, if we put the ethanol to the tank in the vehicle, the fuel cell inside the vehicle generates power and charge up the battery. And the battery drive the car. That is almost electric vehicle, and we can put the energy from the power grid and also put energy from the ethanol. And what we are offering is this kind of sustainable neutral cycle, carbon neutral cycle. And currently, we are developing this concept continuously. This is the current situation. To realize the mobility, we need to improve more for each part. For example, for the system, we are developing the more quick start capable system, and we are going to improve the power density from the system. We are doing this activity with UK agent, UK government funding, with UK partner and UK site in Nissan. And also we need, so this, to realize more variable for this cycle, we need to another investigation or improvement. One is the fuel. We need to develop and we need to inform the value of the fuel, low carbon, low cost. And we need to develop the scenario to how to supply the fuel for the this vehicle. So at the same time, we need to collaborate each part, because without collaboration of fuel part and business part, we cannot realize this kind of new mobility. For example, if there is no reasonable fuel, our management don't invest much more to the development of this system. As the same thing is can be happen in the business side. If there is no vehicle or if there is no fuel, the business cannot be developed. And so I think we would like to find the collaborator in each sector, which means the industry and agriculture and business side. We need all together to collaborate if we make something happen. That is our activity.
Thank you. Henrietta, you don't work for an automotive company, and you don't manage chemical plants, but you have a very active program in social and cultural research at Central Queensland University.
Yes.
What do you think, Henrietta, in terms of sustainable practices, what do you think of all the various things that might be done? What would you suggest as one of the more important?
I think what's missing is the fact that we're seeing all these innovative ways of doing things and creating new products and new ways that's emerging, that's continuously mapping out the way the future is going to go. And what I'm seeing is that there's a lot of Indigenous and local communities that continue to be left behind. And that knowledge system which they have in terms of maintaining and sustaining the land on which they live in, and also doing the continued practice to be able to somehow work against the issues of climate change, and we're seeing some of that happening now. I think the biggest thing that needs to happen is the way to bring together the traditional science knowledge of Indigenous and local communities and work with Western science and try to somehow integrate the two ways of moving forward. The best thing that could happen is working on innovative ways and using new technologies for communities to continue to map their knowledge systems and also to be able to record those knowledge systems. And this is so crucial and it's so important. I think one is particularly with Indigenous and local community who continue to live on the land which they've always lived on or their ancestors have lived, to continue to use the genetic resources for their food and medicine. A lot of this continue to happen, but yet what we're seeing is the erosion of this knowledge system and their way of life that continues through the introductions of these new innovative ways of doing things and new technology. So somehow we need to come together and work together on how we move forward. And because I think Indigenous and local community need to be part of it. There are a number of initiatives happening in this field of knowledge system, and one is the Savannah fire management to again decrease the low carbon emission, and that's continuing to happen up in the Savannah regions up in the Gulf. That's now being transported and that product is now being used to work overseas, and particularly in, I think, in parts of Brazil and Africa. So they're taking an indigenous product of a way of life and maintaining the land and taking that overseas. And this is, again, of what we're seeing in terms of that knowledge system of Indigenous people that are being used. So there's certainly a lot of opportunities out there. There's certainly a lot of challenges as well.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope with those 5 examples that you've got some feel for the myriad of small, some not so small advances that are occurring across the 3 fronts of sustainability, which has already been argued are essential. That is social, environmental and economic. And they all have to be changed. They all have to be achieved. Now, before I go to another question, can I encourage the audience and those out who are not here but are linked in, please send us your questions. We're also going to have a microphone in the room, so that will be roving in a little while. But I have one other question, and I guess perhaps start with you, Jim, and then maybe the others. Is there a potential conflict between the food needs of the future and the fuel and chemical needs coming from biological sources? Or is that not, I mean, you see it played out occasionally, but in your opinion, is that a real issue?
It's far more important than being a real issue. It's perceived to be an issue. And that's always much more dangerous. What we perceive is far more important, because things have to speak to us. They have to be relevant to us. I don't know if, as you look around you, you'll probably notice about a third of you here in the audience right now have your heads down because you're looking at devices. Because no, it's true. And there's nothing wrong with that. And that's a good thing, because what you're doing is you're engaging in something that's really personally important to you. And whatever's on your device right now is what's engaging your attention. And all of us have to be aware that all of us are engaged in dialogues all the time that we can't control on Facebook and other places, and dialogues we have on the Digest and elsewhere around the world. Perception is far more important than reality, and has been for a long time, but is going to continue to be. And let me put that into context of sort of addressing the question of food versus fuel. As I said in my comments about agriculture, if you only produce food, you will cause capital flight so fast out of the agricultural stream that you have that you won't have a food industry, because nobody is going to ride that economic roller coaster. I mentioned Amyris as being a great technology because its stock price is up 300%. You have to ask yourself, in your superannuation, most of you manage that, how many of you would really look at what you own? How many of you look at how much your portfolio is worth? Do you really know what funds you're in? Some of you do. And some of you might know the individual stocks that you might, or shares that you might own. But do you really dig in to see what kind of practices, sustainability practices, are there in your portfolio? Probably not. Most of you look at, how much money you have. And you should. But just think about that for a minute. We need to have sustainable, resilient industries, and that means they have to be economically viable. So we need secondary markets. It's really, really important. So the idea of food versus fuel is an idea, or food versus anything, is an idea that we should be dependent on single markets and single solutions and single products. It has been the road to disaster for every civilization known to mankind and humankind, and it will be the disaster of all of us. We need to have all these products and all these technologies go forward. And it's not just a question of biofuels or biomaterials, it's all kinds of other renewables. And this versus idea is something that's promulgated by people that don't want you to think about the importance of resilience and the importance of having secondary markets that allow these farmers and growers to make a return, because that return is what is, and that yield improvement that they then make because they're making money off their harvest. They're going to be reinvesting that in stewardship of the land, because the person who's making money off the land is someone who cares about the land, because that's their, they'll care about it in the same way you care about your job, because that is their job. So think about these things. That's what we need to think about. Don't think about versus. Think about how to create a resilient economy, because that agriculture that is being practiced out there around the world, as I said in my opening remarks earlier today, that's why you're here in the room. Because your forebears didn't have the option to do all the things that you do, because they had to go home and grow food.
Thank you. CEO from...
I agree with Jim. Part of what the future should be like is how do we innovate beyond the usual, all right? Because we all know that in the past we used to grow corn or maize and take the stock and burn it, all right? Or sugar and take the stock and burn it. But the question should be, instead of saying this against this, we should actually be saying what this and this, all right? How do we take what was the waste from agriculture and make something new out of it? What was the waste from food production and make something new, biofuels, biomaterials, and something else, all right? So that we don't end up with such debates of saying, bioenergy is here to compete with food, because in my opinion, the land is there, it's vast, all right? But agricultural land is minimal based on the type of soils, the water, and all sorts of things. But we see a growing number or a growing amount of waste that is coming out in almost all of the productions that we have in the global space. And innovation should be to say then, what can we do in addition to what we've been doing in the past, so that we don't end up with too much waste that is not being converted into new products. Again, to agree with him that once we start to say the debate is against food or is food against others, we start to box ourselves to say, if we don't do food, what else can we do? How the other industries are moving forward is to say, how do we add more to the original products that we used to produce? And instead of having one product, we actually have more products. For example, in the cell phone industry, we know that when they started to adjust cell phones, and people are questioning, what are we going to do with all these devices when they go obsolete? But now we know that the cell phone is almost everything. It's a cell phone, it's a camera, it's a GPS, and so forth. By additive innovation, and even the same story with food and energy and biomaterials, we need to start to ask the question, how do we add more to what was there before? The food against other, it does not carry any weight to me, unless obviously if someone is doing research in a very irresponsible manner of using food crops or food land and converting it into non-food items, knowing that there's a need for the food item.
Okay, so you're both saying what you need is an economically viable and sustainable agricultural sector, and that needs to go beyond just single dimension.
Sure, because the cost of the price of maize is right now below the cost of production, and has been for the last year and a half around the world. So that means that if you were just depending on the food market, you didn't have these alternative markets, nobody would be producing it right now. And the world without maize is, every piece of meat that you have around the world is, most of it's fed off that. And so you wouldn't have it. Just wouldn't have it.
One of the challenges here in Australia is a lot of Australian soils are extremely low in carbon. We're such an old continent, it's very weathered. And so one of the advances in a lot of agriculture has actually been leaving the stubble, leaving on the soil and ploughing it back in. And it's really because the assessment is the value of the carbon. Sure. In that sense, but it's horses for courses, as you're saying.
Yeah, when you plow, of course, just plowing it back into the ground releases a tremendous amount of carbon and really disturbs the microbial integrity of the soil.
Yes.
So you don't want to necessarily just plow. No. That's 200 years ago. That's our forefathers' idea of what to do with a field, because that's all they knew how to do. But you don't want to plow that stuff back under. Those microbes are important, and you're disturbing their environment. We talk about not disturbing, communities. That community is really important to you. Those microbes, that's how you live. And don't disturb them unless you have to. So don't plow anything. Don't dig up the earth unless you have a real reason to do so.
Troy, do you have anything you want to add?
Oh, look, I think probably just a few observations and put it in perspective in our comfortable little environs that's Queensland within Australia. If you look at agriculture, it contributes, if you look at beef, wool, sheep and sugar, it's around about $60 billion a year as an industry, and there's lots of downstream from that. If you look at the value of the Great Barrier Reef, it's around about $55 billion a year, I think was the price that was put on it. Clearly, you've got challenges with farming practices impacting on the reef. That's a reality in terms of water turbidity, water quality, and that's something we have to manage. And these are real, conflicts in some ways, but at the end of the day, these things will happen concurrently. Australia is the most road freight dependent country in the OEDC. Queensland is the most road freight dependent state within the most road freight dependent country. And diesel runs the state. Tourism, mining and agriculture and logistics. So the reality is that will continue. It's not going to magically change, and it's just about managing those conflicts. One more little sort of factoid, and if I say it confidently and give you a stat, then you'll have to believe me regardless of how accurate it is. But Queensland is the most biodiverse jurisdiction in the most biodiverse country in the world with the Great Barrier Reef. And so we have this large landmass, big farming practices, this small thing called the Great Barrier Reef, and it's all got to stack up economically, and I come back to that. That's the economics ultimately. I mean, government has a role with first generation technologies to provide a hand up, but I think increasingly there's a reluctance to provide a hand out. And I think that's just something that everyone's got to factor into the business that we're in to ensure that you're here in a decade and 20 years.
Okay. Henrietta, would you like to add anything on this question?
What concerns me is the fact that a lot of the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people in this country particularly are out there trying to manage and look after the country, and to also be able to sustainably live off that country. And at the same time, I think what we're seeing here is that there's an issue of imbalance that's going on. And one is, while the Indigenous people want to be part of that economy, they want to be part of that economic growth. However, they're too busy maintaining and looking after the country to try to save it and save themselves from the issues of what's going to happen in terms of the impact of climate change. And that's why many of them are out there now, but they're also voicing their opinion both nationally and internationally and are not heard. But we want to be part of this whole economic growth. Many of our communities they certainly have the land and the ocean to be able to live off that land and ocean. However, they're not on an equal playing field to be part of that. And I think it's time to think about how do we engage with those local communities, Indigenous and local communities out there. How do we bring them in? How do we make them part of this movement of using the kind of innovative ways of moving forward, and at the same time building their own economy, having a revenue coming back into that community stream. They need that kind of revenue stream to be able to live comfortably without relying on government funding. And because I think as we continue to move forward and we leave them behind, we're going to create a lot more problems in terms of the national economy in this country. So we have to be able to work together with them. And this is, the Women's Forum the other day talked about the need to engage and how do we educate the younger kids and bring them forward. And this is where I'm seeing an absence of a lot of the Indigenous students are not engaged in that science, technology and innovation space. So how do we engage them in this? How do we bring them in? And to me, it seems that while there are companies, we're succeeding in doing what you're doing. And the food supply, the food security area is another key area. Why not bring together both the young Indigenous leaders of tomorrow with the innovative groups that are out there, and start basically exchanging that information, making them aware of where this may go. But at the same time, how do we manage that country and still be part of this bigger society to be able to develop that economic growth? We need to be part of it. We need to be able to secure a future for our children and our grandchildren. And as long as we continue to move the way we are, where big companies are moving forward without engaging the Indigenous and local communities out there, we will continue to have great poverty, and we will continue to lead. Those development will continue to move forward, and what we're creating is the poverty gap that's there. And, you know, if you look at the Millennium Development Goals some years ago, they were looking at ways of how do we actually overcome these problems. We're still not there yet. Now you've got Sustainable Development Goals happening. How do we deal with that? Where are the Indigenous voices within this area? How do we move and how do we partner? We want to be able to partner in terms of that economic growth. We don't want to be the victims, and I think that's what I'm hearing all the time from local communities. But again, the pride in people's culture and way of life and know-how, you see it. I'm working with a group in the Daintree where they're mapping the traditional calendar cycle to be able to see just how much has impacted their rainforest in terms of climate change. So this is happening now, and it's going to take a while before they come out with some kind of data that's going to help them to really understand, well, you know, what's been there, what's happening, and how the seasons are actually changing. And that's already starting to happen. So we need to be able to bring the two together. I don't think we can continue on the force of going one way, and that is we want to develop the growth of the nations. And if we're in the Commonwealth countries, we need to be able to come together and move forward on this, because the people at stake in terms of climate change are mostly the Indigenous and local communities, because they're vulnerable in where they live. The people in the Arctic, in terms of the melting of the ice, you got the people in the Torres Strait, and as is in the Pacific Island, whereby the sea level's rising and their houses and everything under threat, and we are already seeing climate change refugees coming to Australia, and I'm particularly talking about the Torres Straits. And so, you know, how do we continue this movement of new technology and growth and create new ways of doing things, but at the same time work with local communities to maintain their knowledge system and make that knowledge system value be on the same value as that of Western knowledge system. And we really do need to work together on this. It's so important.
You're right, Henrietta. Thank you for that. Now, it's time for, you all have to wake up and ask some questions. So if you put your hand up, someone will come with a microphone. There's a gentleman here. Thanks, Mario.
Please identify yourself before we get to the question. Thanks, Jackson.
Thanks, Mario. Jackson Gerard from Department of State Development, Manufacturing, Infrastructure and Planning. I've got a question for Jim. Jim, it was around investment of growing the renewable and sustainable sort of economy. In Australia, we're reasonably immature in the, say, venture capital and philanthropy kind of space. You had that slide earlier with several companies up there, and I think probably a lot of them have been recipients of Department of Defence and Agriculture and Energy funding in the US, and then funders like Vinod Khosla and so forth. And what might need to happen in Australia to really sort of bring forward our bioeconomy and our sustainable economy in terms of bringing forth that sort of risk capital and so forth that will have some significant changes in Australia?
Well, risk capital, they love technology risk, and they don't like any other kind of risk. They don't like policy risk. They don't like country risk very much. Australia's got a very nice profile for venture capital. and for family office investment, which is another area that's very powerful. Also tribal investment. Sometimes tribes have real stakes in and funds to invest. So equity is always going to be a challenge with emerging technologies. The two criteria, the two things you need to do to attract it is, first of all, you have to have very good rates of return, and the technology has to generally address a market of around $10 billion or more. So it can't be a niche thing, it has to be fairly big. So in Australia's case, it either has to be a very, very big thing that you're attempting, or it has to be deployable elsewhere around the world. So that would be, you know, one thing. Secondly, it has to be materially advantaged, and you would need venture returns, which is 30% returns per year. So over, if you know, a 10-year technology, you can do the kind of math there. So you want technologies that are going to be very, very quick to market, because you're not going to attract venture return, because you won't be able to offer venture returns, so you won't get venture capital. The only other thing that you need to have is slightly lower taxation, because it just bites into the venture return. So if you have very high taxation, you don't need 30% returns, you need 40% returns. And that's what's going to attract it. You know, that's what venture capital is in the business of. And they do eat technology risk for breakfast, and that's the good news. But you do need to provide those returns for them. If you have something that will provide 30 to 40% returns for them per year, remember per year, not 40% one time, then they'll find you.
Okay, other question here.
Just please identify yourself. Thank you. Hi, Brian Mitchell. I'm with the House of Reps Standing Committee on Innovation, Industry, Science, Resources. I'm not sure who to direct this to, either Troy or Jim perhaps. The issue of monoculture, you're talking about the importance of getting an economic return, and also diversifying, you know, so that if we're growing food, make use of fuel for the waste, that sort of thing. But I'm concerned about the impact of monoculture, and particularly palm oil, across, you know, the rainforests of Southeast Asia. But also we've seen in Tasmania with monocultural tree plantations, and if monoculture displaces diversity, thank you, you know, where does that leave us? And the issue that you raised, Troy, about the importance of an economic return, that has to be based surely on government has to provide a foundation, a level playing field from which everybody can operate, and then the economic return is, you know, factored back to that. Because if we left everything just to pure market forces, then of course the rainforest will be levelled completely, because that's what the market would dictate. But if government can intervene and say, well, no, that's an acceptable or unacceptable practice, then you can get your economic return after that. I'm not sure I made myself clear there, but.
Troy, do you want to?
Yeah, look, I guess there's a number of facets to that question, and I think if I talk about our circumstances, we're fortunate. We're a privately owned company. Our 50% partner is JJ Richards and Sons, who are the largest waste resource recovery company privately owned in Australia, and they're across every jurisdiction. And there's a lot of utility in having that relationship downstream. The other thing is we're very much looking at waste that have no or very little value. So we're looking at, you know, agricultural waste, forestry waste, mining tyres, passenger tyres, which will perhaps become more important as the government develops, the Queensland government develops its waste strategy. We're looking at biosolids. We're about to make a big announcement with Melbourne Water, who've got a problem in terms of their stockpiles of biosolids. The second largest landholder in Melbourne. And so I guess we've looked at it, again though, it's still not enough. You've still got to look at that logistics, the aggregation of the waste, what reasonable percentage you could take, and what your arrangements will be. We ultimately would see, and look, we're one small part of many good projects that are happening in Queensland, and we do not have all the answers, and I say that very clearly. But the way we look at it is ultimately a hub and spoke model, and if you look at your waste, it's actually generated regionally in the main, apart from green waste. And ultimately what we will see is the best breed of technology that works best for a particular waste stream will be placed in the region where the waste is generated. You don't want to shift any of the stuff in its physical form. And I guess ultimately those returns are spectacular. We've got a board that's got a very patient and have a 5 to 8 year window of return on investment. That's very unusual. And I guess it's those factors. And again, there's still no certainty for us. There's still technical challenges and logistical challenges. But I think the best thing government could do is provide just certainty in terms of policy. And that's difficult when governments tend to change frequently. One of the things I've touted this some time ago, I would like to see people who are looking at big investment in this country, that government of the day, if it's dependent in some way on the policy of the government of the day, that they mirror what happens with large infrastructure projects like building of tolls, etc., and they enter into a deed of assignment. Whereas if the government changes and then throws out that policy, there is compensation. And I think that's something that I've raised directly with the Deputy Premier and Treasurer, Jackie Trad, that I think that would attract foreign investment. We've seen some planning decisions recently I think will cause concern. There's a planning instrument announced by Minister Dick, who's a wonderful guy. It's going to have some downstream impacts on investment in the Ipswich area in waste to resource recovery. Make no mistake, it's problematic. And I think that certainty, and if you're an investor and you look at a jurisdiction that seems to change its mind every 2 or 3 years, when you've got a 20 to 30 year window, it's just not that attractive. So I think there's some mechanisms can be looked at to provide certainty for big investment, and I think that would accelerate investment. And I think ultimately though, your company, as my initial comment, is have a look at your complete value chain and understand it in total. A good idea and great technology, sadly, these days is not enough.
If I could just add just a quickie on, just to address the question of monoculture and biodiversity, because we need to kind of think about those terms, I think, as scientists committed to the bioeconomy, let's think about what those things mean for a second. First of all, there are certain parts of the world where if you could just grow one thing, that would be a miracle. If you could grow anything in the desert, that's terrific. So monoculture would be a huge step forward. There are certain parts of the world which are naturally only have 1 or 2 things in them. If you go up to the alpine level, you might only see trees because they can only they can handle the rocky, acidic soil that you find up there. So mostly when we talk about the idea of biodiversity, we talk about areas where which are not naturally monoculture, they're naturally more diverse. And there are reasons to think about biodiversity, but let's think about it this way. 99% of the organisms that are in an ecosystem are below the ground. Only 1% is above it, and almost nothing that in our genetic soup, if you will, is visible to the human eye. And almost everything is microbial, almost everything is really, really small. So when we talk about preserving biodiversity, generally speaking, what we're talking about is preserving stuff that we can see. And we're talking about preserving stuff that's above the ground. And I just want you to think about that for a second, because virtually nothing you grow above the ground is really going to affect, in a profound way, too much the diversity of what's below the ground. And so when we think about biodiversity and we think about monoculture, let's be a little bit more sophisticated about it. Let's think about what biodiversity is and what we're trying to preserve. And just remember to think about what's below the soil, not just what's above the soil. And pulling out one thing and putting in another, you need to look at it a little bit more in a more sophisticated manner than just sort of saying, oh, that was these 10 things that were growing there above the ground, and now there's this one thing that's there, so that's a loss of biodiversity. You've lost 9 species, but there are 1 million there. So you haven't lost too much. So let's just be sophisticated about how we think about monoculture and how we think about biodiversity. And I think we'll have a better, safer, happier planet by having a healthy dialogue that's based on science and not slogans.
Okay, I think we had one more question. Was that right? Here, but before we have, just right in front. Just before doing that, can I go back to Henrietta's answer or comments previously, and I was interested to see her in that gap that she talked about and the fact that the risk of Indigenous and some others being left behind what's your experience from Africa?
Yeah, I think it's a good point that she's raised, and in our approach, we always say, look, it all goes back to communication. Are the people that you're trying to solve their problem knowledgeable about what you're trying to solve? And second, do they want the solution that you're trying to bring? And I think there was a speaker yesterday who mentioned that you can innovate as much as you can, but if the people who are supposed to take your innovation are not necessarily interested in it, you might end up without any innovation at all. So what we always do from the Africa Bio's point of view is we go out into the community, educate them about some of these technologies, tell them what is a GM technology. Obviously, we package it in a manner that is understandable to them. And what do we mean when we talk about gene editing? What will it do? What are the products that they are likely to produce out of them? And to start to look at what are their needs, all right? Obviously, you've got to tie in the economic angle behind it, because if you are a mega corporation and you know what the market requires, you then adjust your technologies to meet the market requirements, all right? But when it comes to technologies that are geared towards the community, and if you don't engage that community and you don't get them to participate in how it's packaged, what it would solve, what problem of theirs will solve, and how they need to understand and use that technology, then you end up with a case where you have all these products, but the people whom you think you're trying to innovate for or you're trying to produce products for don't necessarily buy it because you've left them far behind. So it goes back to how you communicate to your technologies to the community that you intend to impact, but more importantly, how you work with them. In our case, again, just to add more, is we normally work a lot with small-scale farmers and in getting them to understand that when you bring to you a water-efficient maize for Africa, a seed, what would it do? What is it trying to address? And how does the alternative not address your matters? To do trials, to compare this and that, and get them to understand that this is why we want you to use this technology and this is what's going to solve, and then eventually get them to run with the technology themselves, right? Not us saying, you shall do this without knowing what it's all about, And that's why I say I agree with you that get the communities to be part of the discussion around why is there a need for innovation, what it is that you're trying to solve, and what problems are you trying to address, and how will your innovation basically address those problems.
Thank you. Last question, quick one, I hope.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm Pradeep from India. I'm into the real estate space. And right now there's a huge boom in the real estate industry in India to provide affordable housing. So the government is being lenient on giving extra land for the developers to provide housing. So as a builder, how can I move towards a sustainable goal? And how can I recommend the governments to better their policies?
So this is as a builder, is that what so you build houses? Okay. Would you like to tackle that one?
Oh, sustainable housing?
Yes.
What are the best ways?
He's a builder,
Sure.
and I guess he's asking how he might move in the direction of more sustainable buildings.
Well, there's a couple of things that are available to you right away. First of all, sustainable building materials. You want to make your homes as energy efficient, energy neutral as possible. Some houses are low energy, some are passive energy. There's no energy necessary. Giving your clientele a choice is a good thing. So use advanced materials to create lots of choice. There's plenty of advanced materials out there. And from a community point of view, think about building communities that are different than our traditional city and suburbs, and there's, somewhere out there is this thing called the regional Australia that we don't see very much. Think about building a community where people don't have to move very far to work. It's one of the things that you can do by putting jobs very close to the homes and finding good ways to do it, because there's certain jobs that are tough to put next to the home. But reducing that commute, reducing that carbon footprint that you have, so it's not just about having a nice sustainable material, but also think about your community planning and where you're putting your housing so that people don't have to move around quite so much to do the things that would be, to get to work more efficiently, to get to the store more efficiently. All those things can reduce the carbon footprint and actually make people happier, because the less you have to travel, move around just to get around your day, the more time you have for your other pursuits and for your family, and that's a wonderful thing. So that's part of sustainability too, is a happy family, is a sustainable family.
Thanks, Jim. I'm conscious of the time, and there is another session, so I think we've heard, apart from the particulars from the individuals, I mean, a number of things have come across. One is the fact that sustainability is multidimensional. It's not just environmental, which is the way it is often cast. Social, economic, are both. Without those, you won't have a resilient and a sustainable system. The second one, I think, is the concept of early engagement and communication is an area which in my opinion, we will never get it right, but you've got to keep going. We don't do it particularly well in many ways, but we've heard, I think, that it's an absolutely key element in ensuring that that the innovation side is actually accepted by those parts of the community who don't necessarily get it of the first instance because they're not trained in the same way. They don't necessarily think in that way. But that doesn't mean that, of course, just reinforces the need for the communication and the engagement. It has to be early, it has to be real, but it's also got to occur. They're the two overarching messages I heard. I guess to finish, I just want to hear from the panel. Are you optimistic or pessimistic that we are making progress towards this broad mountain of sustainability? Are we going up the mountain in a way that you're satisfied with? Are you an optimist or a pessimist? So you can't say too many words. Start with you, Henrietta.
I don't know what we're doing, but I think the way we're moving, there's certainly a lot of distraction, and you know, I just come back to the argument in terms of sciences and what's the microbes under the ground and the biodiversity and what we see above. If there's a traditional way of doing things, you would always try to maintain what's underground as well as maintaining what's above the ground, and a lot of those food supply are part of that. How do we make use of some of the food chain that already exists, that's used by a large group of local community groups? And why not make that part of their economy and build that economy so that, one, is they can build on that and they can maintain that and they can continue to use it. And I guess the reason behind that is there are so many laws and regulations about the uses of some of those traditional food supply that we don't have a chance to look after. We don't have a chance to, one, is build an economy at the same time, maintain those cultural practices. But are we ending here? Oh no. What I'd like to say is that what we do need is we need to be able to come together. I think we can't continue to walk the path that has a large gap between us. We've got to be able to at least crisscross and work ways of pulling people together and working towards it. I would like to see a lot of our young leaders, our young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in this country, to be able to get themselves involved in the science technology field, be a lot more innovative in the way forward. I think there's a need to do that in order to survive, in order to be part of that economy. But we need to go ahead and do that to be able to make sure that they become partners within those establishments and not be victims. And therefore there needs to be a way forward that brings everyone together.
Okay, thank you. Kamijo? Are you an optimist or a pessimist?
Yeah, I am optimistic. Yeah.
You are optimistic?
Yes, because technology is always improving the situation.
Jim?
Optimist.
Optimistic.
Optimistic, Paul. Life's too short not to be.
It is. It is too short. So likewise. So with that, thank you all for joining us. Thank you to the panel. And we have a very quick changeover, so please stay in your seats. We just have to change headphones or give the headphones to someone else. So would you join with me in thanking our distinguished panel?